Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Network Security in the Cloud, sponsored by Vectra. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackleford, SANS analyst and CEO of Voodoo Security, and Joe Malenfant, Vice President of Product Marketing at Vectra. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters. And Dave, just confirm that you can see my screen, and I'll go ahead and go on mute and you can take over.
I can still see the screen. Looking good. Fantastic. Okay, good stuff. So thanks everybody for joining us. Super excited to be here with Joe, and really got an awesome opportunity to work with the team at Vectra in putting together a specialized survey instrument focused really on network security in the cloud. So there, the title du jour. But what we're going to be talking about here are lots of really interesting and compelling shifts in the landscape of technology that have occurred over the course of really the past 12 to 18 months in particular. So if we were just talking about cloud in general, and hey, who's not just talking about cloud these days? It's a huge topic. There's a lot of things to discuss. And certainly there's been just innumerable impacts on security as a result of this change in sort of mindset towards service-oriented infrastructure and planning and building that. But in particular, we've seen big changes in the way that connectivity is happening. We've certainly seen some very large changes in the way that organizations are provisioning assets and sharing data and using data and provisioning data for their different types of constituents and stakeholders. And so there's a long, long list of changes that have happened gradually, but some have happened relatively like succinctly over the course of the past 12 to 18 months, and we'll talk about that. So one thing to note, of course, is that it's not all unicorns and rainbows. We've got lots of great examples where, truthfully, we've just seen the cloud being a target too. So, and most people know this today. This is not something that's probably that surprising to any of you that are out there hanging out with us, but we've had bugs, we've had database exposures, we've had some fairly significant outages. We had DigitalOcean had a disclosure of a breach in April from earlier this year. The very recently released Verizon DBIR, which I'm sure everybody probably pays attention to. Huge sort of monumental shift that happened this year. For the first time, more cloud-oriented and cloud-related breaches and incidents than not, which I think we've kind of been waiting for. I will certainly speak for myself. I've been waiting to see those trends and changes happen. They've been moving in that direction, but for those guys across the landscape of their data set to finally jump out there and say, check it out, it's finally happened, here we are. So I think what we're realizing is that, yeah, of course, we're all moving to the cloud. Lots of things are happening in the cloud, but the attackers aren't idle, right? There's lots of things going on for them to focus on. Again, sometimes it's the cloud providers themselves having issues. Sometimes it's bugs. Sometimes it's just poor configuration on the part of the stakeholders that are building things in the cloud. The list goes on and on and on and on, and we could certainly talk about that for an hour or two, but we're not going to because we have other things we want to address. So here we are, key questions today. What are we getting into? We are going to be talking about a couple specific things. So number one, we're going to talk about some of the big just landscape changes in cloud. I think that's important. What's happened out there? What transitions have occurred? What kinds of things have people found, to be significant with regards to security and networking changes that they've seen? But number two, really this list of questions that's a bit more emphasizing the landscape over the past 12 to 18 months. What's happened with remote workers and cloud access? Do people consider the cloud to be a part of the enterprise network now? Have we gotten to a comfort level where we're just so interconnected in sort of a hybrid configuration that that's the case? How are organizations using things like network traffic and things like network metadata for detection and response? That's something we've really been striving for significantly over the past, let's call it decade and a half in an on-premises world. how are we transitioning into cloud there? I think that's a big and very important question. And are we thinking of cloud the same way as we've thought about our network stack altogether and the infrastructure security that goes with that? Because let's face it, for most enterprises today, the network is something we spent a lot of time focusing on. We put a lot of really interesting controls together. We put a strong kind of quote unquote perimeter stack together, as well as some internal controls. What's changing out there?
Hey, Dave, it's Joe. I'm just going to jump in here real quick because I think these are all the questions that we really want to answer, and especially for anyone attending, the network stack hasn't changed, right? We still have the 7 layers. We can arguably add layer 8 if you want to include the human into it. But when we start to look at the cloud, that's where things are completely different. And the data that we're dealing with, it's almost like talking a different language. And if anyone has any key insights, anything that they want to share, feel free to drop that into the chat, because looking at the cloud as part of your integral network, but having to deal with a completely different data set and source of data type is where I think that we really want to get to, right? And how are we bringing those together?
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And I think that's maybe the theme in the background, if there is one, that notion that, we've got a pretty good solid comfort level with what the network has looked like. Is it different? Have things significantly changed in such a way that we start asking, do we need to look at it entirely differently? Are the tools different? The controls different? Are there layers that we don't, need to focus on as much anymore? There's a lot of stuff to actually dig into. And before we get to that, I think it's worthwhile to mention that we got a great and very broad representation set in this survey. And that's always what we strive for when we do SANS-specific research and try to drive this, because, look, there's a lot of organizations out there that all have needs to use things like cloud services. And so we want to make sure that we're represented relatively well. We've got a lot of, sort of organizations in terms of size. We've got some really, really big organizations. We've got a lot in the middle. We've got some that are on the smaller side. We've got a lot of different roles. So we got lots of IT ops. We got security ops. We got some executives and other folks that are responsible for leading programs. We had good geographic representation, which is always good. Truthfully, what I found consistently, as an aside, is that most organizations, wherever they are in the world, when it comes to cloud, have a lot of the same initiatives and goals, right? There may be some differences uniquely related to compliance or regulatory concerns. Certainly, for instance, if you're based out of Europe, privacy might be right at the top of the list versus something that's maybe second or third, depending on where you're coming from. And that's just an example. But most organizations have the same goals, same drivers, a lot of the same types of controls, and certainly the same adversaries. And so that's been something, I think, honestly, that's been encouraging, just to note that, hey, we're all kind of in this mix together, trying to figure it out as we go along. And that's also the same across industries. Now, I will say that there are definitely some unique differences in terms of industry with regard to what the focus might be. So if you're in the technology space, you might be a bit more cloud native, for example. You might be more prone to, hey, you know what, we're building the whole thing in serverless. It's all microservices all the way down, right? Whereas in a traditional environment, maybe in a banking type of scenario, yeah, you've got some things that, you're absolutely not putting your Swift network into the cloud yet. And so there's going to be some distinct elements of, call it legacy or traditional on-premises infrastructure that's not going anywhere soon, right? For a lot of different reasons. But across the spectrum of organizations and organization types, most of the different types of folks that we got responses from and heard from had a lot of things in common, probably more things in common than not. So some big takeaways. So I'll start with these takeaways, and then we'll drill into some of the fun data that we pulled back in. But what we first saw is that across 2020 to 2021, so going back over that last real year to 18 months, the biggest areas of cloud growth were from workforce and collaboration SaaS services. That may not surprise anybody. In fact, we've definitely noted at SANS, and just talking to people in the community, just, kind of casually, that there were some rapid and, sometimes even dramatic accelerants in terms of project cycles for some of the things that were either in flight or planned for a little further down the road, due to the fact that everybody started working remotely very, very quickly. So that doesn't surprise me, but certainly it's nice to, kind of get that confirmation. We saw that over 16% of the respondents had experienced a breach in their cloud environments. Some of the types of breaches included configuration weaknesses, which we just seen consistently. We're going too fast, right? Credential and account abuse, and then things that you don't know about, right? So there was some shadow IT noted in there. We found that just over 67% of the organizations consider pretty much across the spectrum of delivery models, right? SaaS, PaaS, and infrastructure services. That's included in network scope, right? We are connected all the time in various ways. And so most organizations, you got, 2/3, that's a pretty significant percentage saying, yep, absolutely, this is definitely part of our network scope. And we saw that the top network controls in use today for security specifically include things like web app firewalling, some network access controls, and network intrusion detection and prevention. But there's a lot more nuance to that story too. So I think, getting that perspective, seeing what people are coming back and telling us, it's always useful, but there's just so much other data that we really want to talk about and describe here. I think it's worth jumping in. So, survey says, well, yep, people shifted towards remote workforces. We knew that. And all sorts of great and interesting tales to tell along the way where, obviously we did see a lot of people shifting to remote work and sometimes relatively quickly. Again, 2/3 said, yeah, COVID-19 definitely changed the game for us. That brought an increase in our cloud service use. 22% said it hadn't, and then another 12% just weren't kind of sure as to what they were doing. But I think that's a reasonable expectation. I mean, COVID-19 changed a lot. I mean, I don't know about any of you that are hanging out unless you are extraordinarily long-lived, but I've never lived through a global pandemic before. And most enterprises certainly don't have a definitive plan for a global pandemic that they've implemented in the past, right? And certainly anyone that they had going back 100 years wouldn't be anything remotely effective today as far as the nature of work. So we all had to figure this out is the short story here. And some organizations really didn't have a whole lot of cloud service use increase. In fact, what we generally took away is that for those organizations, they were already using a lot of cloud services. So it wasn't as though they had to quickly jump in and make a bunch of changes, but a lot of folks that either were using some cloud services needed to expand that. Some didn't have some of the cloud services that they ultimately realized they needed and quickly flipped the switch to be able to facilitate that. And again, we saw that not only did that happen, but the attackers certainly paid attention. And we'll get to some of that information here in just one second. So here we are, people are working remotely. And I think we probably expect that, at least in part, to continue for the foreseeable future. So what changed, right? What are some of the things that absolutely changed? We said, hey, look, what stuff are you already using? Where did you guys increase use of cloud? And where was the, sort of first use of some of these different types of cloud services? So I think it's always interesting to find out where people just jumped in for the very first time. And the highest numbers for first use, believe it or not, here was desktop virtualization. I thought that was really interesting because what it showed you is that maybe there weren't enough systems to provision out to people. In fact, I had a couple clients that had exactly that happen. They didn't have corporate laptops to hand off to people that had traditionally come into the office and done their work all the time in like healthcare settings and other places. And they needed to be able to securely provision access to stuff. So they set up sort of an intermediary desktop as a service. Cool, really interesting use case that shook out of cloud, sort of provisioning and first-time cloud use. And, from there, of course, we saw software-defined networking as another big one. And so, again, naturally, you're thinking to yourself, do we really want to drag everybody back kicking and screaming for, VPN and some of these other things? Or do we have new ways to do this? Can we facilitate a software-based network connection somewhere else? Can we, provision people straight to the cloud? Lots of differences that went on there. So again, another one I think interesting in sort of that first-time use scenario. But then you said, okay, what were the increased usage? As I said, collaboration apps were big. Some of the workforce apps like Dropbox or storage, I think those were big-time changes. But a lot of this stuff, to some degree, was already in use. Joe, what did you guys see out there in terms of this?
This is totally not a surprise. I'll share a bit later on the IaaS part, but about 18 months ago, we had really started looking at Office 365 and the collaboration tools because of some of the activity that we were actually seeing and the tools that are built into it. So I'll get into that a bit later. But the IaaS part is really interesting. That this is one of those, we have our hair on fire. We've got to move quickly. There's things that we can't provision fast enough. Let's just do a lift and shift, right? And they moved applications up into an IaaS or a PaaS type environment. So I think that 29 or the IaaS number there in red, the 25%, is actually one of the ones that I found the most interesting of all of this.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. Like, hey, no better time than a lift, for a lift and shift than in the middle of a pandemic. Like, there's not enough already going on. But to the point. Yeah, right. I mean, I think there was a real shift in priorities almost across the board, and it just manifested in different ways depending on what was in flight and on the docket. And so, yeah, it's always interesting to see at scale kind of what organizations decided to sort of make a move on based on just the nature of work itself. Hey, why in the world are we dragging everybody back on premise to get to this legacy app? Let's go on ahead and move it to the cloud. Everything's going to the cloud. Let's take this with it. So I agree. Yeah, it's interesting to see some of those changes that are coming about. And of course, right there in parallel, I mean, lots of security impacts. A lot of things people came back and cited and said, we definitely, it wasn't all, painless as far as security was concerned. I mean, just about half of the respondents came back and said, yeah, we don't have really great visibility. That one just always stands out to me. People feeling like there's not enough visibility into their cloud infrastructure. And then from there, you sort of go down and say, all right, in my opinion, a lot of traditional issues just manifested differently, right? So, things are happening a little too fast. We're not sure about sort of best practices and standards. We're not 100% sure about, and actually the third one down at 35%, not knowing where our sensitive data is. That's disconcerting, right? You're moving into cloud. Where is it? So I don't have visibility. I'm not sure where my sensitive data is. And oh, by the way, we're moving way too fast and we're not sure what we're running. You throw that all into the mix together, and that could certainly lead to some issues. So at least to me, and Joe, I'm sure you might have a comment or thought on this too. I look at this and say, that's got the potential for perfect storm. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but to me, this means we've got some work to do.
And if we take that first one, right, imagine if you were to solve that lack of visibility, the cascading effect that it has. So if you were to actually get better visibility into what in the world is going on in your cloud environment, oh, well, now we can actually pinpoint where sensitive data is actually geographically located. So there's a cascading effect to increasing that level of visibility that will subsequently solve a lot of these other problems underneath.
Yeah, that's a fair point, right? Yeah, if we had great visibility, if that was just a negligent factor, which other issues here would either go away or be significantly diminished? That is a great question. And it's one that I think, we should all be asking, quite frankly, as we're transitioning into more cloud use and looking to, modify, augment, enhance our security stack all the way around. For those that said, hey, we did have some attacks in the cloud, we did in fact experience some big issues. Some of the things we saw here, right? Misconfiguration, sure enough, just didn't know what was going on. And remember, we did see roughly, just under 17% of the respondents saying that we did in fact have an attack. So in that group, again, it's admittedly a smaller group, at least those that are, either honest or know what's going on. So let's be candid in saying there's also some open-endedness there. But for at least those that said, yep, we definitively had an issue, then, you go back to what we just showed a moment ago. Sure enough, it's configuration. It's also shadow IT, things we don't know about. And it's account hijacking. So credential and account hijacking, just due to that shift with the end users. In fact, going back to the Verizon DBIR as a tie into this, if you really read through that, they tied that together and they said most of these cloud-oriented attacks were tied to credential hijacks for users that were then provisioned into cloud assets and into cloud resources. So there was some correlation that went on there. But again, tie it all together, I think to Joe's point a moment ago, it's still lack of visibility. You're not seeing where the privileged users are or how they're behaving. Where we're seeing pivoting from the cloud to internal systems in, just under 20%, roughly 20% of the scenarios there. So again, where's the visibility across cloud to internal? That's definitely a big concern, but it all comes back to, we're not sure what we got going on. Now, so again, talking about some of this, and, kind of going back and saying, hey, look, 63% of the respondents said they weren't aware of an actual breach. I'll tell you the thing that stood out, and this is what I really wanted to emphasize here. So we just talked about what happened in the 17%, right? We did experience a breach. Another 10% actually said, hey, we think we have, but we don't have enough data. Back to the point, lack of visibility. Maybe there's some things we don't know about. The big one that stands out for me is the 11%. It's the 11% that's, we just don't know, right? Because I would almost rather know. I mean, I don't wish a breach upon anybody. Nobody does. But, I would rather have some degree of certainty as to what's happening, whether it's positive, negative, and so forth. 11% coming back and just saying, we don't really know whether we've had a breach or not had a breach. That, to me, is the biggest indicator that visibility issue that we talked about just a moment ago is going to continue growing and is probably going to manifest in even worse ways going forward. Like, if you don't solve this visibility problem now, how is anything going to improve?
And with the, Dave, interestingly, the 63% who didn't know about a breach, I always like to ask, well, is it the term breach? Because, that seems if you ask most CISOs, when did the breach occur? Or how do you categorize when a breach has actually occurred? Over the course of the last time that I've been in security now, the common answer seems to be as soon as I have to pick up the phone and call the lawyers. So it might potentially be 63% of respondents said they weren't aware of an actual breach because the lawyers weren't called, but they might have actually had an impact.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, when do you actually, pull the fire alarm and say it's happened versus, yeah, we'll just sit on that for a second. And, I mean, it's hard to say. You're right. There's a lot of, sort of subjectivity that's sort of tied into that. But, I think at the end of the day, admitting that you don't know what you don't know is the most terrifying thing that shook out of all those statistics. And as an organization, certainly speaking as a security professional and one that, has spent a lot of time focused on monitoring and, facilitating SOC operations and things, that's what you're striving for, is to know what's going on, at the very minimum. And coming back to that 20% number, I mean, people pivoting from cloud to internal systems and looking at 2/3 saying, hey, the cloud is a part of your network now. The way I would see this, coming from a security professional standpoint, is, everywhere that's my network, whatever I'm calling my network, I need to have a solid degree of visibility and understanding of what's going on, right? And there's like classic, tried and true controls and levels of monitoring and so forth that I feel are just standard best practice for any enterprise today. That's not happening. Right? 2/3, the cloud is part of the network. 20%, 1 out of 5 in our cloud incidents, which again, it's not a staggering number, but it's enough to certainly sit up and pay attention. Pivoting. So they pivoted inbound. Why wasn't that detected or blocked or both? Right? So those are really interesting questions to me.
I can help with that a little bit later.
Absolutely, right? Like, big open questions, right? And so, the broad answer here is SaaS, infrastructure, platform. Pretty much all those are considered by most to be part of the network. And I think a lot of the brokering options and things like SD-WAN are rapidly becoming part of that as well. Things like multi-cloud brokers, not quite as high yet, but sure, if you're facilitating a bunch of your traffic coming through a CDN, or you've got an edge service that, a lot of people are connecting to and through, and your branch offices are plugged into there and so forth. I think, sure, of course, that's going to be a part of your network, right? It's the WAN. It's just a different form of WAN. And so I think these numbers, this is just my projection. If we're asking this question a year from now, 2 years from now, there's zero doubt in my mind that these numbers are even going to go up. I think more organizations are going to feel like the cloud is absolutely a part of the network, and that's just going to keep growing. And what that means is we got to adapt the controls that we've been using into the cloud, right? So we asked the folks that responded which technologies they had successfully implemented, and they came back and told us, WAFs are pretty common. Network access control is also pretty common, and then network intrusion detection and prevention. Over half said VPN and SD-WAN. I thought that was interesting. SD-WAN seemed to be a little slower growth, but I think some of that was accelerated during the course of the past year as well. And then, again, it sort of goes down from there. I was a little bit surprised that network traffic analysis wasn't a bit higher on the list, truthfully, given that we have the means to, gather and collect and perform traffic analysis in at least the larger cloud environments today. So I was a little surprised at that number.
The VPN number actually really didn't surprise me. So, I spent the last 6 years at Cisco working with AnyConnect, and I left that role to come over to Vectra midway through the pandemic and saw a pretty significant uptick in the usage of VPN, but it was a fraction of the amount of people who are actually working from home. So VPN's being used, but only by those who really need it. And to your point, Dave, the NTA side, this is where I always think of category names and how people think about them. Like if I saw network traffic analysis, I kind of want to be like, okay, what are you doing for me? Are you just looking at network traffic? Does that include the cloud as well or not? And how well is it? Is it easy to implement? I think there might be some trepidation on that one.
Yeah, that's fair, right? And, or maybe, degree of completeness, right? Like we're doing it sort of. Right?
Yep.
And they don't want to, check the box just yet. So yeah, fair point. Maybe the journey is not yet complete is sort of the way to look at that. And truthfully, when we asked the question about integrating in-house and cloud networking, so not just have you done it, have you integrated? That was also interesting because we got some pretty good responses here. Network access controls, yep, we feel pretty good about it. To your point, the VPN, SD-WAN, still pretty solid numbers there. Intrusion detection, WAFs, those kinds of things. But I always look at what's on the roadmap for you guys, right? What are you looking at in the next 12 months? And, things like DLP I thought was interesting. Network traffic analysis at just about 22%. Software-defined perimeter was pretty big. So obviously looking at more like the SD-WAN, SDP type of stuff. But it's obvious that these projects are absolutely on the table and in flight. So I think we're maybe in the middle of it all is kind of what I took away from this. I think, a lot of organizations are still figuring it out. Maybe Joe, to your point just a second ago, they're not done yet, but they're moving in a positive direction with a lot of this. So we definitely wanted to find out whether existing vendors or solution providers were accommodating for this shift into cloud scenarios. And this is sort of a loaded question, and we knew that coming in, right? If you're saying, hey, did you successfully implement some of these technologies with a single product or a single control, versus having to, sort of slice and dice it all up, maybe across vendors or, doing some integration work. WAFs stood out, right? So again, the same, specific things that we saw in the last couple of research points. WAFs and network intrusion detection and prevention were right at the top of the list. Network anti-malware I thought was kind of an interesting one as well, but and network access controls, because here's what I kind of took away from this. I mean, number one, the WAF market is not a huge one. So there really are a sort of select number of providers that have been traditional enterprise player in WAF. And most of them have had a presence in cloud scenarios for a while, right, from the marketplace there. So I don't think I was really that surprised, especially if you spend a bunch of time creating rules for WAFs and so on. I look at network IDS, IPS, and things like network access controls, and maybe even, kind of just lump that into the, next-gen firewall type of market. Same thing. Those are mature spaces that have been in existence for a long time. And if you've spent an inordinate number of years or however long provisioning and building out an infrastructure on premise with a solution that's working for you and you're comfortable with it, and you go out to, AWS or GCP or Azure or wherever you're going, And lo and behold, that provider's got a pretty solid option for a virtual appliance or what have you in the cloud. Okay, cool. I think that's a logical leap, right? The other ones I think are a mixed bag. What that tells me is that, maybe the vendors haven't made it there, or some of them haven't. Maybe organizations are inherently not 100% satisfied with some of the things they've done on premises for things like traffic analysis or DLP or what have you. And so they're not trying to use the same solution provider. We're not sure, right? So again, a little bit of a loaded question on this one, but it's always interesting to find out whether people are able to use the same solutions from one environment to the next.
And I would love for anyone from the audience, if you want to throw it either in the chat or the questions directly to any of us, how you're actually using network IDS for cloud traffic. I would love to hear that one. Like I said, I was at Cisco, and part of the security business unit there was, when I joined, was right after the SourceFire acquisition. So seeing network IDS, IPS being applied to the cloud and what it takes for getting those signatures tuned and maintained all the time, how that's being done in an environment that's so vast as the cloud, especially where misconfiguration of cloud services or resources was the #1 problem. Love anybody's feedback or stories on how you're doing that successfully.
Yeah, and that's actually my background as well. So yeah, I was a network intrusion analyst. I was a network engineer that suddenly woke up as a network intrusion analyst, and so very near and dear to my heart as well. Is it working? Is it not working? Is it just for the north-south ingress, egress? Elsewhere? Yeah, tons of questions. And would love some feedback from the audience if you guys have any comments or thoughts on that stuff. One thing to note here is that we definitely saw an uptick in the use of things like APIs, which is good. And I think the reason for that is just because of the scale, to Joe's point of cloud. You're not going to get there with a lot of manual work, right? So what we wanted to know was, how are you tapping into this? Are you using this for things like network flow or behavioral monitoring, for network access controls, for network detection and response, or NDR, event analytics? There's a whole bunch of categories here that could easily tie in. What we saw, as you can see here, is that the majority, I think, are trying to immediately jump onto that network flow data, sort of ingestion for monitoring specifically. That stands out. That's, over 2/3 of the respondents, coming back and basically saying, yeah, this is sort of the way that we're going with it. Which, like I said, I think maybe just from the simplicity or ease of integration, that would make some sense, but not so much from, just ingesting data in general, right? Just for monitoring in particular, but not trying to take it in and correlate, and certainly not from the protection side. But beyond the network flow and behavioral monitoring, it's a little more evenly broken down, based on what I see here, right? So network access controls, it's sort of an even split for things like monitoring and protection, which makes sense. It's access controls. For detection and response, it's still mostly for monitoring, but some ingestion of data, we're bringing some of that in, and then a little bit for protection. So just about 1/4 of the respondents on that one. And then for event analytics, closer of an even match for who's performing monitoring and just data ingestion, and again, not so many there for protection. So I don't know, still feels like there's people fleshing this one out to me, except for maybe that flow data. So one of the other things that we wanted to talk to folks about was cloud network metadata, and whether or not they're using that data, and then if they are using that data, what particular types of that data are they finding most valuable? So there you go. Half of the organizations are using this. So I'm chalking that up, by the way, as a huge win. And what we saw is that the majority are still down a little lower in the stack, right? So you're still down at more of that sort of layer 2, layer 4 traditional net flow data, which I think coincides with exactly what we saw just a moment ago with, people getting that sort of flowish data out of their provider environments. But we saw a pretty solid number getting up into that app layer metadata as well, which honestly, that surprised me a bit. I did not expect that as many organizations would be getting and using that app layer metadata as they came back and said they were. The custom metadata from the providers and so forth, that doesn't surprise me. But I expected the app layer metadata to be a little closer to that bottom number, right? To the sort of 59.8%. So that was an interesting takeaway for me.
Yeah, same thing, Dave. I mean, this I'm not totally surprised about this, especially considering when you look at the IaaS shifting your resources up into the cloud, and what are you going to be able to monitor? It's going to be really things like, for example, if you're using AWS, it's going to be the VPC logs, right? And that's what you're going to be able to get the most out of.
Right. Yeah. And that's the whole thing, is it still feels like it's a little bit in flight, right? Because you can just immediately tap in and say, oh, great, I've got source, destination, good stuff. But at the same time, rolling that up to something that's meaningful from an app perspective has a lot more value. And so, I get why people would want to do that. It's just not always that easy to do, especially not with the cloud providers' native tooling and mechanisms. So, that's the whole thing. And in fact, this is one of the arguments I always make is, look, I would love to see everybody getting more network metadata and really putting it to good use. But the feedback that I always get, and Joe, I'm sure you hear some of this too, is, how do I put it to use, right? Because, really, I'd love to be able to identify indicators of compromise, or get command and control traffic, or rogue assets and services. And certainly even further than that, looking at like legitimate TTPs, MITRE ATT&CK framework kind of stuff, and so forth. But, if you try to just do that in a wholly cloud native way, it's extraordinarily challenging, if not impossible, based on experience.
Yeah, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, because you're right. It's really hard to do, and like I said before, it is a totally different language. I mean, even the logs themselves between the different cloud service providers, they're all different.
Yeah, absolutely. Every one of those provider environments is sort of its own software engine. Mm-hmm. And especially for multi-cloud organizations, that is a non-trivial task to overcome, right? So let's wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it off to Joe. Look, we get some great info from folks. It's always nice to hear what's happening out in the community, particularly with the dramatic changes and shifts that's gone on in the last year and a half. We definitely got some feedback from folks. At the end of the survey, we always say, hey, what did we miss? What else would you mention here? And we got some pretty consistent responses. Number one, a lot of respondents said we need more and better APIs and better automation capabilities. We're not keeping up with it as it is. We need more of that. We need to prioritize centralized tools and services as much as we can, because we're getting too scattered. We're looking for better integration for network monitoring. And back to what we were just discussing, it has been a very long and slow road, even getting the cloud providers to open some of that up, right? So, if it's a closed situation where you can't get packets, you can't get some of this stuff, certainly not easily, that doesn't help security analysts and security operations teams trying to, sort of get that degree of visibility and up the ante. And so it feels like progress is slow, or it has been slow, even with the acceleration of the cloud. So those are the big takeaways, that we certainly looked at and got from this survey. But I want to hand things over to Joe to talk to you guys about sort of what you guys are seeing out there at Vectra.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on my slides. I want to breeze through a lot of these. I'm going to think I have control. So this overall, the survey was incredibly interesting, because it really helped us to see from the practitioner point of view how the cloud is being seen as part of the overall extension of the business and the network itself, and being able to leverage that existing security stack to protect part of that business, right? So I've been commenting here with Dave. My name is Joe Malenfant. I do lead product marketing here at Vectra. I've been in security for the past, I think like 12, 13 years, something like that. I started in industrial control system security, where, security 12, 13 years ago wasn't really a thing until we had Stuxnet hit, and then it became a really big thing. I've spent a lot of time in endpoint security, IoT security, and obviously network security as well. And one of the interesting parts about this last year and a half that I've really seen in my own personal take on it is the shift that's happened within adoption of the cloud, the rapid adoption of the cloud, and the lack of visibility there is not any different than where we were in like 2014, 2015, where endpoint protection was very static until a few different people came along and said, hey, we can do detection and response on this stuff. And then today, things like endpoint detection and response is completely the norm over top of legacy AV, right? So I'm trying to switch slides, but it's, oh, okay. I don't know why this is not somehow, I am zooming in on slides. Don't know why.
It's Carol. It's Carol. I will, let's,
Oh, there we go.
I'm going to go on mute. You should be able to click in advance now.
There we go. Thank you, Carol. So now that we're over our technical hurdles, basically, you know, Vectra does have its roots in network detection and response. And about 2 years ago, we really started studying not just, we started moving beyond the network because of things like O365, AWS, and GCP. And what we noticed, here we go, trying to advance these. What we looked at when we started with O365 was the most interesting thing, right? Is there's a lot of applications that are built up inside of there. For example, Power Automate, which you can use to create automated workflows, or eDiscovery, which can be used to find assets. And those are really powerful applications that are built inside of this technology in the public cloud for us as IT professionals. But if you're an attacker, you can turn around and say, oh, I can use things like Power Automate to automatically exfiltrate data to a separate site without you actually noticing. And so when we started studying the Microsoft and O365 stuff, and we found some of these things, that led us to say, wait a second, if we're finding this in here, what can we see in AWS? What can we see in GCP? And as I mentioned earlier, all of those log sources are very, very different. And I can't imagine, you know, somebody who's in a smaller security operations team trying to actually do this, because it's taken us quite a while. I mean, over a year now. We just released our solution for AWS. The O365 one was almost a year of development and doing the research on that. And the reality is that those pieces are different. So, and we want to make sure that we're looking at the network and the cloud holistically, because they can't be viewed as a separate silo, or else you end up with massive visibility gaps, right? So ultimately, you know, I think going back to Dave's point is the cloud is not something that people are talking about potentially doing in the future. It's here. We're pretty much all using it. I mean, we use it all on a daily basis, and we can't look at it separately. It has to be connected back with what we've been doing historically and taking that into account. Fun fact that I like to share is in 2019, there was a survey by a company that was looking at account takeovers in Office 365. And at that time, there was 5 million monthly active users on O365, and they had 40% account takeovers. Cool, that's a lot actually. That's a little bit scary. So we redid a survey a few months ago, back in April, and said, where are we at today? And the answer came back to 71%. Well, that's pretty high. And especially when you take into account that it's gone from 5 million to 250 million monthly active users. So the law of big numbers has really gone up, and unfortunately so is the attack surface, and people are taking advantage of it. And now that we're all in this hybrid environment, we're starting to have these, what I like to call, you know, breach Monday. Because every Monday morning, it seems like you wake up and there's a new breach in the headline. I mean, I can mention Colonial. There's a bunch of stuff on here that the headlines aren't the important part, right? I want to ask why, because it's dang sure it's not for a lack of trying. There's obviously many hundreds of security professionals here on the line today, and the ones that we get to talk to on a daily basis, smart people doing their jobs, but why is it actually happening? And I like to step back and look at what are we actually doing realistically. And when you look at this survey, this is why I was asking if anyone's using things like, you know, network IDPS for the cloud. I'd love to hear anyone and how you're actually doing that successfully, because I think a big part of the reason that we are seeing a lot of these account compromises and takeovers and the breaches that are occurring in the cloud is because we have a false sense of security right now. We've overinvested in this prevention technology, And if I use a stat from Gartner, I think it's something like 88% of the overall spend will go into prevention. But if misconfiguration of cloud services and resources is the #1 problem, and there's a total lack of visibility, you can't prevent your way out of that. Having misconfiguration isn't a prevention issue. It's supposed to be, but unfortunately, when you misconfigure something, you don't know that it's misconfigured, and then somebody's taking advantage of it. And the perfect example is, I'm going to use something that's been slightly maybe popularized, but the solar flare compromise, the supply chain compromise. This one really paints the picture of this over-reliance on a false sense of security, because SolarWinds and any supply chain compromise, right, is coming from a trusted source. So they immediately had the backdoor into the data center, and from there they pivoted straight over to the cloud and established a presence there, waited, and then came back into the environment to deploy the hidden sunburst tunnel. So prevention would have never caught any of this stuff. Maybe at the very, very end, when they were exfiltrating data, there would have been seen, but because of where the traffic was emanating from, unless you were watching where it was emanating to, it was already too late at that point. So the over-reliance on the prevention side, and coupled with, hey, we need to improve our visibility, says we need to spend a little bit more time on looking at what we can actually see from a data standpoint, which is why we point all of our researchers at, hey, let's look at what we can gather, and then how do we codify it into detecting when things are a problem. And let me be very clear that we do use AI. AI is how you do something, right? It is merely an application of a methodology. You could write a signature, you could use AI. There's lots of different ways. I don't know whoever coined the term how to skin a cat, because that's terrible, but there's definitely more than one way to skin a cat when it comes to doing detection. And we simply use AI as a way to do it, right? We have a large team of data scientists who are very separated from the security researchers, and they're the ones who codify it. And the whole reason for that is there's so much data, whether it's at the network packet level, whether it's up in a cloud log, and regardless of which cloud service provider you use, maybe all of them, and all of it is very, very different. So our goal is to really reduce that security gap and the over-reliance on prevention and detect stuff before it really becomes a problem, or as the CISO would say, before I have to pick up the phone and call the lawyers. And how do we actually make it a reality? I'm not going to dig into the AI and all that stuff. You're welcome to go and read through our patents if you want, but really it comes down to looking at the different sources of data and saying, okay, we've got packets on one side, we've got logs on the other. The security research team says, here's the problems that we're actually looking for. And then the data science team says, here's how we're going to do it. Because each of those has their specialty, and the data scientists are not the security researchers aren't the data scientists. So those two are two separate teams that come together to create the methodology so that we can do real-time detections. Surprisingly, we're actually the only solution that can connect a cloud account with a network account to do threat detection, so we can see what's on-prem and what's happening in the cloud. Going back to the solar flare one, for example, we didn't have a single customer that was actually impacted by that event, because way early on, when it wasn't called solar flare, when no one had a name for it and we didn't know who it happened from, what they actually saw was, hey, there's this hidden HTTPS tunnel being created that shouldn't be there. They can actually go and close it down and not be affected by it. So how we deliver it is this. It's really from the network. We do it for the cloud and then provide all the data. I don't want to spend too much time here, because I think, yes, we have a product. Yes, we have a platform. Yes, it runs on AI. And yes, it does network detection and response and cloud threat detection and response holistically in that single place, right? I think what's important is, number one is we talked about visibility early on. In this report, people said, hey, visibility is my #1 problem. And frankly, that's not a surprise whatsoever when you're moving to the cloud. I feel like the move to the cloud was a lot like when we started putting the network infrastructure in place 20 years ago and just saying, yeah, we can connect all this stuff. Oh, wait a second, what about security? COVID did force our hand into moving to the cloud and basically took a 5-year digitization plan or 5-year digital transformation plan and said, hey, that 5-year plan, 60 months, you got to do it in 30 days. We've had a lot of customers just basically after 30 days, they were so burnt out, right? And I'm sure a lot of you feel that way. So visibility is the number one thing that we want to solve. And that's by collecting the traffic, parsing it out, and doing detection on it. But like I mentioned, we are the only solution that actually tracks and links the cloud account with the network account and the network host itself. So if you were to find one particular compromised account that had now been using an on-prem host or vice versa, traditionally those are two very separate domains, and a lot of tools don't work for both of those. So that was a big problem that we looked to solve. The second is the signal to noise ratio, right? So that you can focus on what matters. I have yet to come across a security operations center prior to, in my earlier career, I was at Lockheed Martin working in the security operations center there with that team. And there was never a day where it was, hey, we have so few alerts that we don't really have anything to do today. Not true. No, there's just a ton of noise. So what we look to do, and this is why we use the AI, is to reduce that noise level, to say, hey, we're only going to provide you with a really high level alert and tell you which ones are the most critical and why they're the most critical. Just because you see a Tor exit node, for example, that's not necessarily indicative of malicious behavior. Now, it might be suspicious, but it's certainly not malicious. When you start coupling some of those together, you have some weird sign-on activity, you've got somebody creating some new transport rules in O365. Those things getting layered on together are indicative of malicious activity. So that's number two. And then lastly, we want to identify the threats that are targeting the users and the hosts, not just a list of detections, right? Having an arbitrary list of 150 detections, but they're targeting only 2 hosts. We're going to tell you who's the hosts that are actually impacted on this. Who are the user accounts that are compromised on this? Ransomware, all the ransomware in the last 6 months that we've seen, and in fact, I'm going to go back to the last 18 months, really starts with privilege account compromise. And so doing a credential-based attack for ransomware, that's how we're attacking the ransomware problem, is saying, we're looking at who's getting popped, what's actually happening, the staging activities, so we can tell you you've got ransomware activity long before encryption actually occurs. So that's what we do. That's very different from everyone else. And obviously we're going to have to integrate with your security stack. That's never an issue. I think this is a bit of a de facto requirement these days, at least in my books. You need to have a good, robust API to integrate with everything else, and you need to have out-of-the-box integrations, especially with SEMS and SOAR tools and EDR technologies. So we do have a very tight relationship with a lot of those EDR vendors. So not going to read out any of this because everyone's got eyes and they can actually take a look at some of the outcomes that we deliver. What I prefer to do instead is say, listen, if you want to see it for yourself, I've loved doing this survey. It's been incredibly insightful. Dave's provided some phenomenal analysis. Love working with the SANS audience. If anyone wants to actually see it, try it, go to demo.vectra.ai and try it for yourself, right? Don't take my word for it. Take 30 minutes, walk through it. The solar flare attack is in there. There's credential-based ransomware attacks in there. You can go and poke around on your own and see how we do things, the full detection guide. How we actually apply AI is in there, what we're looking at. So feel free, encourage you, and tell them Joe sent you. So I'm gonna stop here because we've got about 5 minutes left. I wanna make sure we get any questions that we've got.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. Let me take a look here. We do have some questions ready, and I'll go ahead and get started. Do you have any data on users moving back from the cloud? Some have found it to be cost prohibitive versus on-prem for storage and backups.
Wow, Dave, I can definitely opine on that, but let me ask if you've got anything first before we jump in.
Yeah, I'll just say we don't have any data specifically that we can toss out there in terms of actual numbers, but I've seen it happen in a very, very few number of cases. Not often, but there have been several cases that I can certainly even speak to from my own experience where certain projects just didn't end up making sense, for moving to the cloud, and they did go back. But it's not that common, at least based on what I've seen.
Yeah, 100% agree. I'll echo what Dave said and add that I think the challenge, and especially what I've seen with people moving to the cloud and then moving back to on-prem, is because there wasn't hey, what data should be going into the cloud? If you're arbitrarily throwing everything in there, there's a lot of traffic to store. But if you take the time to cull through and say, what do we actually need to store in there? That's when it is not cost prohibitive in the least, actually.
All right, thanks. This one came in about 5 minutes ago. It says, isn't the 63% in the same group as aren't sure in a way where they are not aware?
63% not aware of an actual breach.
Well, yeah, I guess you could look at it two ways, right? The 63% that came back and said, no, we have not had a breach. You have to take it with a grain of salt, I think, and make the assumption that they feel confident they have not had a breach. But if we're, opening it up a little bit and saying, well, this visibility problem is pretty pervasive, maybe you just don't know, then I think, sure, you could extrapolate that and sort of tie them together. But I think you have to take the data sort of at face value without going much, much deeper.
100% agree. When we're looking at some of the things that are occurring within the cloud, right? I used an example earlier of Power Automate. If you as an organization don't use Power Automate, but we're seeing, and you're not even monitoring for it, and you've got, let's say, for example, Vectra in place, and we say, yeah, we're seeing a lot of traffic or a lot of your O365 and your Teams and your Microsoft instances actually using Power Automate and moving stuff around. Is that, again, necessarily malicious, or is that the visibility that you need to say, oh, maybe there is an issue going on here? So I think that the lack of visibility and the 63% not aware of an actual breach go hand in glove.
All right, thanks. All right, we'll squeeze this last one in. It says, how many organizations have you seen that have no on-prem anymore and are entirely in the cloud? Our startup is in that category, and it has made things interesting.
So we've only run across very, very, very few. And when I say very few, I'm going to say less than 5. Those tend to be very small. I'll say sub 50 or size organizations. They're able to move very quickly with the cloud, go on a subscription as a service. They don't have to make a lot of large investments at the front end. And especially companies that have started in the last 2 years have just gone straight to the cloud. Things like, using a lot of the free services that are available, using low cost services. So they keep their overall costs down, but any organization, a lot of our customers, they're all hybrid. So they've all got an on-prem environment plus a cloud environment. So it's very rare, especially as an organization grows in size, I'll say more than 50 people, to have a purely cloud environment. Is it possible? Yeah, definitely.
I'll agree with that. Yeah, it's usually really small organizations, or it's brand new startups, especially in the technology space, where why in the world would you build it on, traditional data center technology when you can just start in the cloud? But for traditional enterprise, I've really never seen it.
And congrats, Justin, on winning that gift card.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Dave and Joe, for your great presentation, and to Vectra for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thanks, everyone.